Entering the Beatles Ashram, we notice the main gate and entrance has now been extensively rebuilt to cope with the constant flow of visitors. But the steep climb to proceed inside remains as it was from its early days. Indian nationals pay a modest 150 rupees, around £1.5 sterling, to enter the ashram. Foreign nationals pay 4 times what the locals do, but most Beatle fans from across the world are more than ready to pay extra to enter the hallowed pilgrimage site. None of this was there just 6 years ago. After Maharishi Mahesh Yogi abandoned his ashram in 1981, when the land lease expired, the surrounding jungle within a few years engulfed it. Everything inside turned into ruins. Yet, daring Beatles fanatics, many of them from abroad, would sneak inside undaunted by the dense undergrowth with wild animals prowling around. It was only in 2015, largely through the efforts of a dynamic forest ranger, Rajendra Nautiyal, work began to restore the abandoned ashram. Today, various buildings inside have been cleaned up, pathways created, and a new exhibition hall constructed along with facilities like a cafe. Yet, the restoration has been careful not to change the basic look and feel of the place to retain the ambience of half a century ago. Soon after entering the ashram, you come across a dilapidated old red postbox. This is where John used to post his long letters to his beloved Yoko Ono, the girl he had left behind in London. She would reply in brief, cryptic messages written on postcards. One of them just said, "I'm a cloud. Watch for me in the sky." John would wait impatiently to collect Yoko's postcards from the counter at the nearby post office. Not far from the postbox, we made a remarkable discovery. At last it can be revealed where the famous group photo of the Maharishi, surrounded by the Beatles and other disciples, was taken after extensive research by Beatles then and now historian Piet Schroeders. He identified the site by studying the many photographs taken on that day. The Ganges and the mountains can be clearly seen in the background, but after an extensive tour of the site, no location could be found. However, a previously unseen black and white photograph solved the mystery. A distinctive tree in the skyline is still resplendent today, and all was revealed. The background is now peppered with meditation pods, but on what was then a dusty piece of ground is now a lawn in front of the newly built Ashram Cafe. Located away from the other structures and occupying center stage in the ashram stands the Maharishi's bungalow. His personal residence, a long, modern-style building on an elevated plot with a terrace, offers a spectacular bird's-eye view of the flowing Ganges River below, and Rishikesh dotted with temples on the other side. Below the bungalow is a basement where disciples newly initiated by that holy man with a special mantra were sent to pay obeisance at a special prayer room. It is one structure that has borne remarkably well the message of time and the encroachment of the jungle. At the back of the ashram are the remains of the lecture hall where the Maharishi used to address his disciples and meditation students every evening. It was also the site of birthday parties for his celebrity disciples. Shortly after the Beatles arrived, George Harrison celebrated his birthday here with the Maharishi arranging for a special musical concert in his honor. A month later, birthday celebrations for his wife Patty, shared with jazz flautist Paul Horn, was an even grander affair with a magic show, fireworks, and of course lots of music, including the Happy Birthday song and God Save the Queen, played on the sitar, among other musical instruments. A cluster of rooms at the far end of the ashram were where the Beatles and other celebrity disciples stayed. They were simple, but not Spartan, living quarters, equipped with Western-style bathrooms and proper beds with mattresses. Inspired by the lush foliage all around, this is where the Beatles, in a burst of creative genius, wrote so many songs, sitting in the front courtyard or climbing onto the roof. The Beatles bungalow is in ruins today, but the greenery and fresh air is intoxicating. One can almost hear the music. Just adjoining the ashram, slightly below, is the beach next to the Ganges. The Maharishi and the Beatles, accompanied by many other meditators, would miss no opportunity to go in a procession to the beach, with the musicians playing and singing as they walked along. At the beach, there would be more music as members of the party dipped their toes and bathed their faces in the icy cold waters of the river flowing down from the mighty Himalayas. Today, the beach lies desolate, barring the odd cow or Hindu mendicant, but the waters of the holy Ganges remain as refreshing as before. Well, I discovered the Beatles when I was a teenage rebel in Calcutta, growing up, and the Beatles, came like a breath of fresh air. We used to hear Elvis Presley and Cliff Richards and all the crooners, but they were the first band we really, enjoyed. And then, of course, the Beatles started growing, and we were also growing up. So both of us were growing up together. I found it very difficult, in fact, to be a Beatles fan in my house, where my father was a very senior bureaucrat. He hated the Beatles. He really hated the Beatles. Because firstly, he felt that, they used to just make too much noise. And then he hated their long hair. And some of my fiercest fights were on my length of hair with him. People like me, who were fans of the Beatles, we thought that the front page should be full of the Beatles and there wasn't enough coverage. Indeed, there were a lot of feature articles on the Beatles, and Junior Statesman took the lead in doing a lot of in-depth features on the Beatles. But it wasn't a surprise, because the Beatles coming to India was really big international news. Well, I think Penguin chose me with good reason. The chief editor was well known to me, and she knew that I was a Beatles fan. She also knew me for my biographical skills, because I had written a very much acclaimed multi-edition biography of Mayavati. And this was, to some extent, looking at history, looking at the past, putting it together. And I can tell you, I did intensive research. And, I'm happy that some of the top Beatles experts and historians have described the book as meticulously researched, and which is very flattering to me. But it is the same journalistic skill which you use whether you're writing about politics or about musicians. And as I started researching the Beatles, I had a completely different outlook to the Beatles. I didn't realize what an amazingly great band they were, and how inventive they were, and how much they kept on reinventing themselves, and their strong India connection, and how much India played a role. Well, firstly, Patty is a very sweet person. And I think we really got along very well. We took to each other. And it's quite amazing, because I think she saw me as a little different from the other journalists who've spoken to her about the Beatles, because, many, many people have spoken over the decades. But, the main thing is that I was asking her completely different questions. I was asking her to recount her experience, almost a spiritual experience of India. And she really liked to remember, her memories of India, because she was really fond of India. And, it's really funny that she remembered her trip with George just after getting married across India with Ravi Shankar, on Ravi Shankar's invitation. She's a very young girl in her early 20s. And it really blew her mind. That's what she said, that it blew my mind. And, he took her to Ajanta Ellora, to the Taj Mahal, to Kashmir, to Benares. And Benares, really, she was so astounded to see bodies being burned on the one hand and the ghats, and life carrying on, bustling, So, it was quite amazing for her. So I think Patty really enjoyed her experience, in just remembering, India. And she was very happy that an Indian journalist, probably the first time, actually spoke to her about what she thought of India, those days. It was quite interesting because, I normally go to international conferences and conferences where political commentators and politicians and policymakers are there. So this is the first conference where music experts and musicians were there. And we were discussing music. So it was a wonderful experience, really. Because, when you come out of your core area and then you come across a different world. And there were wonderful people like Mark Lewishon who knew so much. My lecture on India and the Beatles was a huge hit because everybody was interested in this part of the Beatles they didn't know very much about. And I think I was a real novelty. I was probably the only Indian there. So again, and only person who was really speaking on a part of the Beatles. An important part of the Beatles I kept on stressing, which hasn't come to light. Well, many of them were personal friends. But some people I got in touch, and they were very interested because they had met their Beatles, in their own sort of thing, and they were very, very thrilled that a book was being written about the Beatles in India. So, I think it was a combination of my personal contacts, my journalistic people skills, and also I think the novelty of the subject of my book. So I think all three really combined to make it relatively easy for me, really, to, track these people down. I mean, it was, of course, a huge exercise. Both for the book and the film, to really, to spread the net wide. But, the end really, revealed a great story. So the Maharishi was a very complex character. And there is no question that his knowledge of scriptures, his association with one of the most revered saints in India helped him to convince first an American audience and then a larger audience in the West that he had something new to give. Now, whether this was mumbo jumbo or actually helped them is really depends on who you're speaking to. A lot of people, they actually felt calmer. The first time I went to the ashram, it was just started being restored. And when they say started getting restored, the jungle was being cleared. Because, what had happened with the ashram after the Maharishi abandoned it, after he got into trouble with tax people. So they closed down the Maharishi's ashram known as the Chaurasya ashram. There is a certain starkness and lonely beauty of the ruins. And I think that one should be careful that when you're redeveloping that place, not to, touch that particular, period piece sort of, feeling you get today when you go there. The jungle has been cleared and now it's there. But I think what really can be done is build around it. Build around it museums, build around it concert halls. Let young musicians who play the Beatles, play there. You can really make it into a huge tourist attraction where people will come from all over the world. It'll earn India a lot of money, because the Beatles still are such a big draw. And everybody knows about their trip to Rishikesh. We had a British crew in mind right at the beginning because the producer was based in London and we felt that we'll use a British crew. And then it was very difficult to get permissions, and I managed a few contacts in trying to get the permissions, and the last moment it had got very delayed, so the crew didn't come. We were really very, very worried. And of course, then we came to an Indian crew. But it was a blessing in disguise, because the Indian crew delivered beyond our expectations. They were fabulous. I think the big advantage was they knew the locale, and they were technically, of course, very competent. And, it was a great experience, really, to shoot in India with an Indian crew. Foreigners do attract attention. So they merged very easily. And for camera crew and everything, it's very important, not to, have crowds around them, things. So, I think it was, a very, very good experience with an Indian crew. And I must say that it was very smooth, and we got more or less every bit of permission. So we didn't have much of a problem, really. It was surprisingly smooth, our shoots across India. It was a wonderful experience with the Savages. To have all four of them together, because one had heard of the Savages, and they were an iconic group. They were one of the first, groups who were actually recorded in India. One of the first, Indian pop groups, Western pop groups. It was quite amazing to get insights from them of what they thought of the Beatles and how much the Beatles meant to that generation of musicians. So it was really incredible. The Savages, the Jets, somebody like Ajoy Bhose, who's regarded as the Bob Dylan of India, how he, responded to the Beatles. Even as a schoolboy, he went to Rishikesh. So it's quite an amazing, this is something which I didn't know really. And, it was all a revelation to me that how much these people had, benefited from the Beatles. This is the Jhula in which Lakshman, the Indian god, brother of course, the great Ram, went to the gods. And there was a, myth around the Lakshman Jhula always. And of course, the Beatles going across the Lakshman Jhula and the photographs of them crossing the Lakshman Jhula in the 60s, when there was no really road, but you had to do it, on foot. That itself was also a very interesting place to be. Now, of course, it is closed, unfortunately. But we were so lucky that we could shoot it, and the scenery is so spectacular from the Lakshman Jhula, because you have the Ganges below and the mountains, above. So, it's a lovely, really lovely, place really to be. And in many ways, it became somehow a motif of the film, that Lakshman Jhula. He was really amazing man. Pete Schrader put it all together. So what photographs we were taking more than half a century later, he produced these sort of sketch of exactly what was before. So I think that is one of the really amazing points of the film. That history, seen purely through the eye of the artist or the cameraman. Half a century later, he just mapped it perfectly. So I think we really gained from that. It adds a dimension to the film, which I doubt, most other films wouldn't have. There's a photograph which I personally uncovered of a little girl at the Oberoi lobby when the Beatles first came to India in '66. And the look on her face and the look on the Beatles' face was such a lovely photograph. And the other one, of course, same trip, is Prabha Dutt, a good friend of mine. And there was Prabha as chief reporter of a newspaper, leading newspaper in Delhi, sent to interview the Beatles. And there she was in her sari, sitting very demurely between Paul and John. And that's a lovely photograph. It brings out, so well, those days. And I don't think these photographs have ever been seen because these are part of a personal collection. Well, in my research for my book, of course, I knew that, it was a historic meeting and that George and Ravi Shankar just hit it off immediately. But what was really interesting was to hear from Ayana Angadi's son, Shankara, the actual eyewitness account. And I didn't know that Paul McCartney had come. And because after George came and Ravi Shankar took to George and George took to Ravi Shankar, they just were, huddled in a corner. And Paul was feeling very left out, so he was just furiously smoking. And what was funnier still was Shankara's little sister, who was a schoolgirl. She kept on collecting Paul McCartney's cigarette stubs, which she took to school the next day to show off Paul McCartney's cigarette stubs. But yes, it was really quite amazing to get these details and how the family got in touch with the Beatles first, because they carried this one snapped sitar string to the recording of Norwegian Wood, and then that was what led to George Harrison becoming really acquainted with Indian music, and then that's how the momentum of his involvement with India took off. Well, I think to some extent it's there very much in my book, and of course it's reflected in the film, because we're looking at the 60s. And 60s is probably one of the most interesting decades in recent history. I think all these issues figure in the 60s, and in many ways, they're the start of that. So it was an intensely political period. This was also a period of sexual liberation. I think the Beatles in many ways reflected that. Because if you see the later Beatles, more and more they were commenting on social issues. And I think that the evolution of the Beatles from just pop stars who sang just love ballads into serious, multifaceted, pioneering musical artists, I think was a part of the times they lived in as well. Indeed, really. The late Ajit Singh, because unfortunately he passed away just a few months ago, but he was such a wonderful man. And he gave us really a deep insight into the Beatles and into that whole Rishikesh atmosphere. Because he was there for George's birthday, that was the first time he went. Then he went to Patty's birthday a month later, and he became friendly with George and John. His little vignettes of these two characters, their trips to Dehradun, to his shop, were wonderful, really. And, I got very close to him. because the man he took to the Beatles, who was a very young man then, Nick Nugent, who was a friend of mine from the BBC days. And, I used to do broadcasting for the BBC those days. And Nick turned out to have attended Patty's birthday and the film. And I think one of the amazing moments of the film, and I think underlines the kind of hard work we put in the film, is to get Ajit Singh and Nick Nugent together at the same spot. They stood and enjoyed Patty Boyd's birthday half a century back. I mean, it is an incredible moment. And, to capture that moment of them looking back, at what happened 50 years ago, is something really remarkable and memorable. And to my mind, that is my favorite moment of the film. But the Beatles have a huge, across the world, across generations, audience. It is quite amazing that a band which broke up more than half a century ago, they are still so popular. And it is not just the Beatles generation, people like me, but very young people love the Beatles. So, I would say it would connect to everybody. And I think this is a part of the Beatles story which not many people know about. So therefore, there'd be great interest. The Beatles at least brings back some sense of romance, some sense of joy, some sense of hope, really, in the world. And I think that, at a time like this, you realize the importance of having the Beatles in your life.